and has research interests in philosophy of religion and philosophy of language. Prior to his current appointment at DePauw, Cullison was associate professor of philosophy at the State University of New York at Fredonia. His topic tonight is moral knowledge and moral education. Dr. Cullison, thank you so much for giving your time and expertise for the Virtual Alumni College tonight.
So thank you all for coming, and thank you all at home or wherever you are for watching. It's really kind of thrilling to be here, and kind of humbling to be here as well. I fell in love with the idea of academia, teaching here at DePauw University back in sort of 97, 98. And I always thought that teaching at a place like DePauw would be a dream job, and that teaching philosophy would be a dream job. And it turned out teaching philosophy was a dream job, but then to be able to come back to DePauw at the place where I thought teaching at a place like DePauw would be a dream job, well, it doesn't get more like DePauw than being actually at DePauw. So I basically hit the ideal dream job. But then on top of it, I get to not only be a philosophy professor here at DePauw, but I get to direct this gorgeous institute that wasn't here when I was here with, I think, an incredible mission. So it's really exciting to be back, but it's also a particularly exciting time to be back. And just thank you all for joining me. So I'm going to talk today about moral knowledge and moral education. And one of the things I'm excited about being back as director of the Institute is, as luck would have it, one of the puzzle I want to talk about today is a puzzle that I myself have been very much interested in throughout my philosophical career. But it also just so happens to be exactly the sort of puzzle that you should be worried about and be considering if you happen to take it upon yourself to be director of a place like the Prindle Institute for Ethics. So it was just kind of this happy accident that this philosophical puzzle that I was very much interested in also is something that a director of a place like this should be thinking about. And actually, just to sort of see why someone in my position should be concerned about a puzzle like this, I want to just say something very briefly about what it is we hope to do at the Prindle Institute. So a good way to think about what Janet Prindle, the wonderful woman who helped found this institute and who the institute is named after, one of the biggest concerns that Janet had was looking around in the business world after she was the first female partner at Neuberger on Wall Street, looking around and seeing everybody with an enormous amount of wealth and power and knowledge, but still kind of behaving like bullies. And it turns out, you think when you educate people that you're doing a very, very good thing. But as this quote from Roosevelt nicely sums up, to educate a man in mind but not in morals is to educate a menace to society. You think it's a good thing to give someone knowledge, but knowledge can be a very dangerous thing if it's in the hands of someone who isn't also thinking through the ethical ramifications of how they live their lives. And so one nice way to think about what we'd be concerned about at the Institute is we don't want to be in the business of educating menaces. So we have a kind of ethics education mission. And if you want to get a little bit more precise about what we're trying to do, two more concrete goals is we'd like to transform DePauw students into thought leaders in two important senses. I'd like DePauw students to be ethically aware. I want them to be the sort of student in the room that will identify an ethical issue that others might miss. So there's kind of like an awareness component. And I also want DePauw students to be able to lead in a kind of reasoning sense. I want them to be the sort of person in the room who can lead thoughtful, intelligent discussion about the moral issues as they arise. But auxiliary to that, I think we also have the potential to be nationally recognized as an institute for ethics education, ethics research, and just as a place where people can come to discuss critical issues of the time. So that's sort of one of the things, that's a nice way to try and summarize what we're about and what we're interested in trying to accomplish. But now I think you'll see if that's the mission of an institute, why someone in my position should be concerned about the following problem. And this is the problem that I want to talk about today, the challenge for moral education. And here's a nice way to sort of summarize what that challenge is. The challenge goes something like this. Look, moral education doesn't make sense because moral knowledge isn't possible. If you thought that moral knowledge was something you couldn't have, then you can sort of see why someone might think moral education doesn't make sense. And the reason is, you might think that education, an aim of education is knowledge. Why are you here to get an education? Well, you're here to get an education because you want to get knowledge. And so if the aim of education is knowledge, and you can't have moral knowledge, then you might think that it just doesn't make sense to be in the business of ethics education. So that's sort of the core challenge that I think someone in a position like mine would face, a kind of skepticism that ought to be addressed. And I'm going to actually try and address that skepticism on two fronts. One, I'm going to try and articulate or just briefly sketch a kind of view according to which moral knowledge is possible. And then I'm going to say it doesn't matter if it's possible or not. So that's sort of the two ways to go and challenge it. Say, well, look, moral knowledge is possible on the one hand, so we don't need to worry about the challenge for that reason. And even if it's not, even if we can't have moral knowledge, it doesn't matter because that just sort of it stems from the challenge stems from a mistaken view about what the goals of moral education might be and what the end game might be. So that's sort of the two kinds of responses that I'm going to go through. So first, the first thing I want to do is talk about ways in which you might defend moral knowledge. And I'm really going to focus on briefly articulating a kind of view about what knowledge is, a kind of common view about what knowledge is, and then I want to articulate a view about reasonable belief where it turns out that, if you take that view of knowledge and you take that view of reasonable belief, it's not so crazy to think that moral knowledge actually is genuinely possible. So first off, we should probably just say a little bit about what we mean by knowledge. And here's a kind of common, simple conception of knowledge that most people think something like this is on the right track to trying to analyze knowledge. Whenever you know something, you have a true belief. That's an important part. You can't know false things. And just a quick sort of reason or a quick rationale for that is when someone claims to know something, a common way to challenge that knowledge claim is to point out that it's false. So if I went around saying things like Thomas Jefferson was the first president of the United States, and I hope they don't take that out of context on some little clip. I can just see that coming back to haunt me. But so Thomas Jefferson was the first president. Well, the way you would challenge that is you just go open a history book and you say, look, Andy, that's false, right? So you can't know false things. And we challenge knowledge claims by pointing to the fact that the belief is false. But true beliefs aren't enough for knowledge. You can have true beliefs that you don't want to say are knowledge because people are sort of lucky to be right. They're lucky to have arrived at the true belief. A simple example of this is if someone guesses the lotto numbers and has a really genuinely firm belief that that's what the lotto numbers are going to be. They just had this feeling, it's my lucky day. Well, if they turn out to be right, if that if that belief of theirs turned out to be true, we typically say that, that doesn't count as knowledge, right? They're sort of lucky in a weird way. That belief didn't have anything going for it. So this third thing that people think you got to have for knowledge is it has to have something going for it. It's got to be what some people will say, it's got to be reasonable. It's got to be grounded. Some people will say it's got to be justified. But these are all those are all different ways of just describing there has to be some kind of evidence for it, or it has to have something going for it. So knowledge, at least for most people, at least seems to involve reasonable true belief. Okay, so that's what knowledge is. Now, here's the next step. One of the things that I like to defend is I think that all reasonable beliefs ultimately rely on ways that things seem to be. All reasonable beliefs ultimately, that should actually say rely, on ways that things seem to be. Now, seemings come in many stripes. You can have perceptual seemings. It seems to me that there's a table over there. But you can also have seemings that don't seem to rely on your eyeballs in any way. Like if you think about the proposition 2 + 2 = 4, and why do you think that's true? Like, well, I just think about what those things mean, and it just seems to me, upon reflection, that 2 plus 2 equals 4. We also have things like memorial seemings. It seems to me that I had granola for breakfast, right? And I'm not using my eyes in any way. I'm just sort of thinking back, and I'm getting something quasi-picture-like. So seemings come in all certain kinds of types, you might say. And we often appeal to seemings in our reasoning about things. So there's a way to think about the way things seem to you upon reflection. There's a view in philosophy, part of what's called the common sense tradition, that the way things seem to you are sort of innocent until proven guilty. So if it seems true, and you don't have any stronger seemings to the contrary, you don't have any seemings that I ought not trust my seemings in this particular case, then you're entitled to go with it. So that's a kind of view about reasonable belief that I'm very much attracted to. That seems plausible to me. There, I used it. I even said, look, it seems plausible to me. That's part of the reason why I believe it's true. Now, here's a way to kind of sort of push and motivate this view, but at the same time sort of see how this might ground the possibility of reasonable or rational beliefs about morality, beliefs about ethics. And I like to call this kind of strategy science defended. There's this kind of joke amongst philosophical circles that philosophy is the queen of the sciences. But at one point it wasn't really a joke. At one point people said that seriously with a straight face. And I'm actually going to sort of appeal to something along those lines, but I'm going to make it sound less, I hope, make it sound less pompous and arrogant. So here we go. Here's the kind of thing that's a kind of fun trick to do, a fun bar trick with my scientist friends. When they sit around and talk to me and say things like, you know, philosophy's weird. I don't really know what it is you're relying on. You know, we in the sciences like to rely on things like what our eyes tell us. And you in philosophy, I'm just not sure what it is you're relying on. Something that you call intuitions. I don't know what the rules of the game are in philosophy. And so they'll express this kind of skepticism about what philosophers might treat as data. Philosophers might treat intuitions or seemings as data, for example. And so here's a fun trick. If you ask someone, so I like to say, okay, scientist, friendly neighborhood scientist, give me something that you think is true about the world, something that your discipline has given us good reason to think. And let's just pick, I don't know, archaeology as a stock example. So the archaeologist might say, well, I was on a dig, and the really interesting thing about the dig is we discovered that it was a center for this ancient civilization that we were investigating was a center for major trade. It was a major trade hub. I said, okay, great. Well, why do you think it's a major trade hub? Let's say, well, we found, you know, really, really wide cobblestone roads, and we found scraps of clothing that we know for other reasons came from various parts of the world. So the, you know, trade centers, small towns that aren't trade centers don't have these big gigantic roads. You need the big gigantic roads so that the big carts can come in. Small towns wouldn't have these scraps of cloth all over from all these different areas. And I say, okay, well, but why think that that's good reason to think, why think that wide roads and small scraps of cloth from all over are good reasons to think that there was a major trade hub here? And they said, well, that just seems like the best explanation of the data. It's the simplest explanation. It's the explanation that involves fewer weird coincidences. They'll say things like that. And then you say, okay, well, why think that because something's the simplest explanation, that it's the explanation you ought to go with? Or why think that because it's an explanation that doesn't have all these weird fluke coincidences? And if they haven't walked away from me at this point and gotten fed up, they'll usually say something like this, well, doesn't it just seem like that's how we ought to go forming beliefs about the world? Rather than, say, consult the magic 8-ball or ask the Ouija board, like that just seems like a better method. This seems like a better way to get at the truth. But what they've done there is they've appealed to a principle about how we ought to be governing our beliefs, how we ought to be forming beliefs. But then if you think about that, what they're relying on is some kind of seeming that's not, it's not like they went into the lab and had a hypothesis and tested a hypothesis and then boom, out dropped this principle about how they ought to govern beliefs. They're sort of trusting that this is a good way to form beliefs on the basis of some kind of, well, I just reflect on whether that's a good principle or not, and it just seems to me that it is, and I don't have any reason to think that these other principles are any better, so I'm gonna go with it. Well, principles about how we ought to form beliefs don't look all that much different than principles about how we ought to act, right? And so when you're thinking about ethics, and ethical questions about morality, really are just questions about how you ought to act. How ought, should I do this thing or that thing? Should I keep the promise or should I break the promise? Those are questions about how you ought to act. And if we think that it's acceptable in the domain of any area of academic inquiry to take some foundational principles about how we ought to be governing our beliefs, and we think it's okay to do that on the basis of, upon reflection, what seems most reasonable, then it's not all that crazy to think that we could do the same thing to determine what principles of action we ought to engage in and to what kinds of principles of action we ought to endorse. So that's a very quick, rough sketch of a kind of path to saying that, look, moral knowledge or reasonable belief, that's the important thing, reasonable belief about moral propositions isn't all that much more problematic than reasonable belief about principles about what you ought to believe. And everyone, whether you're a philosopher or a scientist, is going to need to rely on some principles about what you ought to believe. And so so that's a kind of way to say, look, reasonable belief about moral propositions isn't as problematic as we think. At least, and this is the hedging claim, at least it's no more problematic than other kinds of things that we really do need if we want the scientists if we want to defend the rationality of the practices in the sciences. Okay, so that's a kind of way to sketch a view according to which maybe moral knowledge is actually possible. There's a lot more that could be said about a lot of this, and maybe in Q&A, a lot more. But maybe in Q&A we can tease out the details and talk about the details that folks are most interested in talking about. Okay. So that was a way to resist the challenge by saying maybe it's not so crazy to think that moral knowledge is possible. But now I want to go at this challenge in a different direction. And so you can sort of choose your own adventure. You could actually embrace both of these responses, or you could pick one of these responses and embrace either. So you can have your cake and eat it too. These aren't logically exclusive responses. So now I want to talk about what the aims of moral education are. One view you could have about education generally is that you're just in the business of cramming facts into someone's head, right? That's what you're doing. And so that you're trying to give them a certain kind of factual knowledge. And so if you're engaged in moral education, you might think, well, what we're doing then is we're giving people factual moral beliefs. We're giving them, this is wrong to do, this is right to do, don't do this, don't do that. And what we're trying to do is cram these moral facts into your head. But I actually think that's probably not the way that people should think about moral education. A lot of times for certain kinds of professional development practices, say in business or in real estate, they'll have these professional development conferences where what they'll do is they'll come together and they'll have an ethics discussion. And what they'll do is they'll basically just trot out a list of rules that you should follow if you're in this business or that business. It's kind of compliance training. Do this, don't do that, don't do this. But if that's the view you have about moral education, you can see why a challenge like this might be problematic, because you think you're just cramming these facts into people's heads. But I actually think moral education is something a bit different. I think a goal of moral education ought to be not necessarily giving someone these list of facts to cram into their head. I think a goal of moral education should be training someone to be the sort of person who recommends what that list of rules should be. It's not learning what's on that list of rules. It's being the sort of person who can articulate what ought to be on that list of rules. And then you have the sort of skills and capacities to be good at trying to come up with a reasonable, acceptable list of rules. So really, what I think we ought to be focused on, or at least a core part of moral education, would be things like cultivating a capacity for what you might call ethical awareness. And what I mean by that is sort of recognize when something is a moral issue. So you'll often, when I talk to students and we're talking about a case, they'll say things like, well, I don't see anything wrong here. And you say, well, but, don't you see that maybe there's a kind of power dynamic here that's problematic, and if you were in a situation like that, wouldn't you feel that there was something weird and awkward about this situation? And then they'll be like, oh yeah, I never really thought about it like that. I can sort of see that power dynamics might be relevant, might be morally relevant. It might be something that someone's worried about. Now, you can cultivate a capacity to be aware of all these different features. You might talk about another case and say, well, don't you think that the person over here might have a certain kind of special claim to the property because they put their blood, sweat, and tears into it. Doesn't that give them a kind of right? And you might think, and they'll say things like, oh, I never really thought about that if you invested time into an unowned resource, maybe that gives you a kind of special claim. And now the thing is you can be trained to identify a wide range of what you might call these morally relevant features, but that could be just a matter of being able to identify the kinds of things that get people upset about situations and getting a kind of vocabulary to talk about what those features are. And you can train people to do that kind of stuff, but you don't have to. You can do that without thinking that moral knowledge is possible. You might think that at the end of the day it's going to be really hard to arrive at the moral truth here, but maybe we can still make some headway. Maybe we can still sort of get along if we're all carefully deliberating about these kinds of features and trying to think through this together and come to some kind of, even if we don't think we can know ultimately what the moral truth is, come to some kind of understanding about a sort of second best course of action. I'll say a little bit more about that here in a second. But the point is, you can give people knowledge of the kinds of things that generally come up as being morally relevant, even if the person that you're giving that to might at the end of the day think, we're not ever going to ultimately know with 100% certainty what the right thing to do is in this case is. So there's something that can be learned, even if it turns out we can't have moral knowledge about the absolute correct way to go about whatever course of action it is we're deliberating about. Next thing, another kind of skill or capacity that I think you should be thinking about when it comes to moral education is a kind of ethical reasoning component. You want people to be able to reason through these moral issues, but be sensitive and have sensitive attention to these sort of what you might call morally relevant features, the ones that you pointed out to them in the awareness component of it. But again, you can be reasoning through moral issues, you can be identifying ethically relevant features, but still yourself skeptical about whatever path it is we ought to go down. And what you could be doing is you could be ruling out certain kinds of paths without necessarily knowing for certain that the paths that are remaining are the right paths to go on. So, for example, if I'm lost in a forest and I'm sort of looking for my way to go, and I have about 10 paths to go, I have about 10 paths to choose from, I might have been given certain kinds of skills and capacities to sort of say, well, there's a good chance that these paths over here aren't the way to go. There's a real good chance that these paths over here aren't the way to go. I could see why someone would be attracted for going down that path, but I think I'm being misled in some way. And so I can reason through with whatever kind of survival training I've had that one of these two paths is probably my best bet. And what I can do is increase the likelihood that I will go down the right path, but myself be skeptical or think, I don't really still know which path I should take. But after some serious thinking about it, I've done some work, and now what I can do is be somewhat confident that I've at least eliminated some of the paths that are bad, and I've increased my chances of getting down the right path. So you might think you could have an attitude toward moral education that's like that. Even if you're at the end of the day a moral skeptic, you might think that we can still make some headway by learning to recognize what sorts of morally relevant features are that get people upset about situations, and learning about what sorts of things, and developing critical thinking skills and ways to sort of reason through these cases in a way that might help us at least narrow down the array of options to sort of increase our chances that we're going down the right path, even if at the end of the day we're skeptical about whether or not we're there. So, quick closing thoughts, and then I want to take some questions, and we can go into details about any of these things that folks are most interested in going into detail about. So the challenge is moral knowledge, or moral education rather, doesn't make sense, sort of pointless, because moral knowledge is impossible. And I wanted to say that on one hand, we should resist that challenge by saying, look, maybe it really is possible. At least if you think about what might ground reasonable belief, there's a case to be made that we can ground reasonable moral belief, and it's something that perhaps other kinds of reasonable belief that we hold near and dear to us will also have to appeal to. So maybe moral knowledge isn't so problematic. On the other hand, you might think that even if moral knowledge is not possible, there are still valuable skills that can be imparted on someone related to ethical awareness and related to ethical reasoning kinds of capacities, and that even if you thought at the end of the day we might not ultimately reach the truth, we can at least increase our chances of getting there, even if we're sort of unsure if we will ultimately get there at all. So that's a brief overview of this puzzle that I'm very much interested in, a brief summary of two avenues to a response. And so now I'll close by saying thank you and a shameless plug. If you are interested in learning more about anything that's happening at the Prindle Institute, you can check it out at DePauw.edu/Prindle. We also have an ethics news site type blog called the Prindle Post, and you can check it out there at prindlepost.org. End shameless plug. And now, time for questions.
Dr. Matt Hertenstein.
Thanks for the talk. I enjoyed it. You said, if I understood you correctly, that one of the challenges, or a challenge of the Prindle is to rebut that challenge of, well, what's the point in the first place? How much of that is a straw man? Like, how many are there reasonable people out there who really say, well, there shouldn't be places like this because moral knowledge can't be possible, or, if there is, it shouldn't be taught, that sort of thing. Like, is that sentiment really out there? Who's making that argument? How prevalent is it?
Well, that's actually a really, really good question. So there are, at least in philosophy, there are quite a few people who are genuine moral skeptics, and they think, like, you can't have moral knowledge. Oh, right, I see, and that you shouldn't teach it. Well, some of the people who are moral skeptics just really aren't all that interested in the sort of normative domain period. They like to think about other puzzles and problems, so yeah, I think that's the case. I think that is the case, that at least in philosophy there are some people like that. But I actually encounter this more even when I just talk to parents about the Prindle Institute. So, like, I just had conversations at our most recent admissions event where a parent was like, so moral education, what's that about? And they literally asked, so do you, like, give them a list of rules? Like, what's moral education? Like, really, what is it? And, isn't everybody's morality kind of different? And we're never really going to come to agreement on this stuff. So, and then they'll say things like, so aren't we all just entitled to our own opinion about these things? And we're just going to have to be resigned to the fact that we're never going to solve these problems. And they'll say things. So, like, why spend time actually doing that, right? They sort of think, I'm just going to teach my kids what it is I think they ought to do, and you teach your kids what you think they ought to do. And they really don't think we'll make headway on these kinds of issues. And I do think there are people out there like that who seriously wonder, how could you go about doing this?
We'll go to another question here in the Watson Forum, but before we do, I would remind all of our online viewers that there is a link on the live stream page right below the video feed where you can type in a question for Dr. Cullison. So now we're going to go to Matt Mashuli.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Dr. Cullison. my question is a little bit, it was unintentionally, but a little bit of a follow-up, I think, from what you were just saying. Can you say a little bit about the semantics or the meaning, or maybe they're completely interchangeable, of morals versus ethics, and how people, yourself or other people in the field, think about that? And then secondly, my question is, how much do they change over time, or how much are they anchored in something, quote unquote, eternal? How variable are they?
Okay, good. That's two very good questions. So, the word ethics and the word morals, I think, are in many ways ambiguous between a few different senses, and sometimes people use them in a way that are interchangeable, and sometimes they're not. And so really, I think it's just sort of good to stipulate, like, when I use the word ethics, when I use the word morals, here's what I talk about. Here's some common kinds of senses. People sometimes use the word morals to talk about my beliefs or my value, my morals, right? Something like that. Ethics, at least in philosophy, is typically used to talk about the sort of study of right and wrong, so the study of ethics. But when people talk about something being moral or something being ethical or permissible, I think that often kind of gets used changed. So when you use words like morals, sometimes people are talking about my personal values. When you just use the word ethics, sometimes people are talking about like an area of inquiry. When you use words like ethical, like the modifier sense, or moral, people are talking about sort of properties of actions, like whether it's an okay thing to be doing. So I think it's kind of muddy and a mess, and it's just good to sort of state more precisely what it is we're talking about. So I hope that answers the first question. The second question was, do they change over time? So now here's where it's good to sort of keep these things precise. Morals, if what we just mean are like people's values, well, of course those change over time, right? People value different things at different times for different reasons. If you want to talk about what the moral facts are, like well, let me help myself to the claim that there are moral facts for a second. I know that's contentious, but suppose there are facts about what you ought to do. Do those things change over time? And here I'm going to do something that I hope doesn't seem like I'm weaselly. I'm going to say yes and no. Because you might think that what's right to do in a particular case might be highly dependent on a context. So, should I wave my arms around like this? And you might think, well, is waving your arms around okay? And like what I'm doing right now, you might think that's perfectly okay. But circumstances change if there happens to be someone standing right there, and I know they're standing there, right? Then suddenly it's okay to wave my arm around now. It's not okay to wave it around if there's someone standing there. So, the context can change, and you can think of cases where it might be okay to, kill someone if they're trying to kill you, but it might not be okay in other cases. So things can shift like that. But you might think that the reason those things shift, there could be sort of more fundamental principles that sort of are the overarching reason that things are right or wrong. So you might think that if you were, say, a utilitarian, for example, and you think what you ought to do is maximize pleasure or something. Now, that's not a view that I endorse, but let's say you had that view. If they're right, if the utilitarians are right, then that's something that doesn't ever change. It's what you always ought to do is maximize pleasure. But then what the right thing to do is in particular cases is just going to shift on whether or not pleasure would be maximized. So the utilitarian would say, the reason it's sometimes right to swing my arm is because I wouldn't, fail to maximize pleasure by doing it here. But when someone's standing there, boom, I've caused them pain, and it sort of changes what's right in that case. So that's the yes and no answer. Particular things you might think give you a reason to think that moral shift, but general principles might ground why those things shift. I hope that answers the question. It was a good question.
We actually had an anonymous question online that has more to do with the Prindle Institute. I assume you're willing to talk about Prindle and go on the topic. Yeah.
My favorite thing to talk about.
The viewer noticed that you had an undergraduate ethics symposium recently and just wanted to know more about that. What are some of the topics and ideas that undergraduates brought to that conference?
Yeah, so the Undergraduate Ethics Symposium is something that the Prindle Institute has been doing. I've only been here a year, but the Prindle Institute has been doing it for many, many years, I think even since it started. The idea is we actually do a call for papers, so it's not just DePauw students who participate. We solicit submissions from students all over the country, all over the world, and students submit papers on any topic in ethics that they want. But we also have keynote speakers. We have four speakers who we invite, people who are sort of leading thinkers in the theme of UES. And it's kind of a mix of listening to these world-renowned speakers and then doing little breakout sessions where the undergrads are workshopping their papers. And we invite papers from undergrads around the world, but we also have quite a few DePauw students get in on the game. So it's usually about a third DePauw students, 2/3 students from other areas. And then the theme changes. So we just had our recent one. It was called Value in Virtual Spaces. So it was any kind of moral or value related issue that might arise in virtual spaces, online communities, virtual currencies, any kind of ethics issue there. And we actually had a really exciting lineup of speakers. Patrick Byrne, the CEO and founder of Overstock.com, was here, and he's kind of a fan of Bitcoin, the virtual currency, so he was talking about that. He gave a talk on entrepreneurship and disruption. We had Anita Sarkeesian, who actually was just now named by Time one of the 100 most influential thinkers. She's famous for starting Feminist Frequency and critiquing portrayals of women in video games, but she was critiquing portrayals of women in video games, but she herself was subject to massive amounts of online harassment, and so she's sort of become the person people think about when they think about the dangers of anonymity online. So that's a summary of what it's all about, and it's one of the best things we do here. It's really, really great.
Keith Nightenhauser.
Thanks, Steve, for organizing this, and thanks, Andy, for being here for this. I'd like to ask two questions. One is about the idea that moral knowledge is impossible. There might be there's obviously, I think, more than one way in which moral knowledge could be impossible. Yes, exactly. A way you haven't addressed, and maybe this is just not relevant to the students and others you encounter, is that if there actually are no moral facts.
Right, exactly.
If for instance, in the example about trying to find the right path, every path is wrong.
Right.
Or rather, it's meaningless to say that there's a right path.
Right.
There's no such thing as a right path any more than there is such a thing as phlogiston, for instance, in an accurate description of what's going on. So maybe that just doesn't come up, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that. And my bigger question, though, is what are the strongest arguments against university level moral education, in your opinion? I can think of a couple. One is that it would make people really good at justifying to themselves things that they want to do, which maybe aren't so great. You know, Professor Hertenstein could probably talk about the extent to which we want to believe that we're good people, and so people will confabulate all kinds of ways to justify to themselves something that a real neutral observer would say, "Boy, you shouldn't do that." Mm-hmm. Right. That's one problem. And another is that if you did take the view that there were no moral facts, but there were lots of foolish people around who had moral educations, who would do things because they were morally right. If you were good with manipulating these concepts, you could really get your way a lot of the time. So then it would just be sort of a vile way to control people.
Right.
So I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about these topics.
Those are excellent questions. And I should also just add, as an aside, it's kind of nice. Two of my favorite professors are here in the audience, Bob Newton and Keith. I actually had classes with both. Bob was my ethics bowl coach, and Keith taught me ancient philosophy. So tell me if I get this right, Keith. So on the moral facts question, so there's two questions here. Another route to there's no moral knowledge is there are no moral facts. I actually think that's a really good, important challenge. It rarely, when I teach undergraduates, I rarely have students who will, when really sort of pressed will endorse straight up moral nihilism, which is the view that there are no moral facts. So if you're thinking about just the practical aspects of teaching students, rarely that. But there's a close cousin to that I do think students are sometimes attracted to, which is some kind of relativism. All moral facts are really just a product of your culture, and you get something that's akin to nihilism, or it might have similar kinds of effects on their thinking. So yeah, I think there's a two-pronged challenge here to moral knowledge, and the one I was really focusing on is let's set aside the question of whether or not there are moral facts or whether they're moral truths. If there are, could you come to reasonably believe in them, or could you come to have reasonable beliefs in them? But we could talk about some of the cases. We could throw out some reasons that people have offered to think that there are no moral facts. One reason that people have offered for thinking there are no moral facts comes from a kind of commitment to not believing in spooky entities, right? So the idea is, I'm cool with whatever entities the scientists tell me are real. So atoms, electrons, if those things are made of smaller parts, then whatever those parts are. If we need to posit forces to explain why they behave they do, then great, there's these things and the forces. But, I'm not too comfortable with the idea of positing the existence of anything that's sort of outside what our best scientific theory would give us, right? And so you think, well, any other kind of interesting property in the world that we take very seriously as being real can be explained by that. So like the redness of the table, they'll tell us a story about how all of that is ultimately grounded in the arrangements of tiny particles, right? The mass of the chair, the feeling of love that I have in my heart. People will say, well, even that, we can explain as ultimately being grounded in fundamental particles. But then they think, well, what about like facts like wrongness? They think, how could that be like, it's wrong to kill someone for this reason? Like, how do the arrangements of atoms and electrons make that thing true? And it's kind of and they'll say it's kind of puzzling or mystifying how that could be the case. And at least one candidate, so I'm giving you one candidate argument, and one candidate response to that is just to say, well, look, the things that we have identified as right, or that a lot of people would agree are right, we can tell lots of stories about how the rightness or wrongness might be grounded in the way atoms and electrons are arranged. Like if you're a utilitarian, you think rightness or wrongness facts are grounded in pleasure. Well, I can tell you a story about how pleasure can be grounded in the arrangements of atoms and electrons, right? If you think that an important part of morality is how you're treating people, and how you're treating people is a matter of your intentions when you make a promise. Well, I can tell, and if you think your intentions matter for the rightness or wrongness of an action, you can tell a story about intentions according to which ultimately your intentions are grounded in the way atoms and electrons are arranged. So there's a kind of naturalism about the world that sometimes makes people worried about moral facts and how that might fit. And I think one of the best, at least initial kind of responses, is to just introduce people to all the different moral theories that do say that, no, the moral facts really are a matter of this thing over here, and this thing over here is perfectly explainable in terms of the arrangements of atoms and electrons. So there's way more we could say about that. There's lots of arguments against the existence of moral facts, but I just gave you one and a candidate response. So now you had a second question, which was, is sort of, there's two-part. Any arguments against the viability of university education? What do you think the best ones are? And you even gave us one. So I'll address the one that you gave us, which was sort of trains people to be good at manipulation or good at justifying or rationalizing their actions. I think that's true. I do think that if you give someone the resources to reason through ethical issues, that they're just going to be a lot better at justifying their own bad behavior. But I actually think that's probably also true about just about any skill that you could give someone. You could raise like the skill of, like, if you're going to train people to defend themselves, right? If you're going to train people how to defend themselves against attack, well, then they can use that. A bad person are going to be able to use those skills to do bad things. So I think that there are a wide range of skills that are probably valuable to do, And what we're really doing is we're just taking our chances that, and we're gambling, and I think it's a gamble that's worth taking, that it's better to have more people trained to think this way. And the more people that can think this way, the more they'll be equipped with the tools and the resources to call out the people who are using the tools that they've been given to justify their bad behavior. So that's an empirical hypothesis that perhaps we could test. But yeah, I think that's it. I want to get to that other question, but if there are other arguments against university-sponsored moral education, but I also want to give folks at home a chance to ask any question. Is there a question that we should jump to?
There is a question online. Do you want to go to the online
Let's
question?
go to that, and then if there's time, we'll come back to Keith for what I regard as a third question.
Okay. We have an anonymous question online. How do you reconcile two different belief systems that come together with different sets of morals? For example, with regard to politics.
This is a very, very good question. So, okay, so there's an interesting difficulty in weighing evidence generally. That's not just intuitions that you have about moral cases. So let me give you a simple example with perception, and then I want to, by analogy, point to some strategies that can be done in the case of moral disagreement. So forgive me if this is long-winded, but if you can have conflicting perceptions, I can look and over there and see what seems to be a wolf or something, and then I can look again and see that it's not there. So I've got this kind of conflicting perception, and I can do things to test that. I can start to come up with which of these perceptions should I trust, and we'll start appealing to things like, we'll say that the vividness of the perception matters. How many times when you looked did you see it over there? You might start to trust the testimony of people whom you have good reason to think have good vision. You might start to take into account the opinions of others who have good eyesight. And when you might start to think about, like, well, when I had that vision, was there anything else that might have been clouding my judgment? Was I under the influence of any kind of substance? Was I sick? Was I tired? Were there other kinds of things that might have caused me to have a mistaken perception? You look at those and you try and spot one of those perceptions where maybe one of those things might be explaining why you had a misleading one. So that's just a quick and dirty example of how you might start thinking about weighing conflicting perceptions. Well, the nice thing is there are parallels here with respect to things like intuitions. So when two people are having what we call in philosophy a kind of intuition war, I just find it strongly intuitive that this, and someone else like, well, I just find it strongly intuitive that this. You've reached a kind of impasse. What they do in philosophy is they do this thing that they call like explaining away intuitions. So what you do is you start looking at the things that people find intuitive, and you start trying to uncover ways in which people might be having intuitions that are distracting in some way. So if there are things that might lead you to have intuitions that it's the right thing to do, but if you have a strong financial interest in that, we know that can sort of push people to think that that's okay. If the intuition that the persons are having are about a really kind of complicated proposition, you might think, well, they've got this complicated moral principle. I'm not even quite sure what it says, but maybe their intuition isn't all that strong. You can consider like the vividness of their intuition and the likely vividness of your own. You can consider if they're angry. There's evidence to suggest that when people are angry, they're much quicker to judge that something was morally wrong. There's actually also interesting studies to suggest that when people are in states of disgust, like if you put something that smells nasty in front of them, and then you ask them a moral question, they'll be more likely to judge that it was wrong. So there are all sorts of things that can play on our psychology and push us to think that things are okay and things are wrong. I think one of the best things we can do is start to try and get a good sense of like what some of those things are, and when we've reached a kind of impasse, reflect on ourselves. Is there anything about this situation, are there anything about my moral intuitions right now where I might be subject to some of these distracting things that we know can influence moral judgment that seem like they have no business influencing moral judgment? And is there anything that the other person might be in a situation in, where might they be in a situation where there are things that could be influencing their moral judgment that have no business influencing a moral judgment? You can start to spot things like this, and that at least gets us some way toward trying to resolve moral disagreements that appear to be intractable. That's just one strategy. There are other strategies you could employ, but that's one that I'd really like to ask people to think about. Is there another question from the audience? Or
Not online at this time, no.
So go back to Keith's.
Sure.
So Keith, you had what are the best arguments you can think of against university-sponsored moral education? And the one you gave was a kind of it can give bad people some tools to be even badder. The one I was just offering is that it doesn't make sense because moral knowledge is impossible. There's another one I think. People I think are sometimes afraid that when it comes to the moral domain, the people up here are not going to be very impartial. And so you might be worried that it's going to be hard to find enough people who we can entrust to get up in front of a room full of impressionable young minds, start leading a conversation about moral matters, and not really just be trying to indoctrinate a group of people into thinking whatever it is they think. And I think that's sort of a kind of worry people have when moral matters get brought into the classroom. But there, I think the remedy is really just thinking very hard about who we hire to be teachers and who we entrust with the duty of talking students through complex moral issues. I think it's good to have people who themselves can reason critically through both sides, who can really, really appreciate both sides of a moral issue. In my own case, when I teach classes about certain kinds of philosophical issues, I'm so worried about coming across as partial toward a view that I'll sometimes err on the side of, if anything, I indoctrinate the other side. Like I swing, maybe I swing a little too far to the other side. But yeah, I think that's a concern that people have, is that it's a path to indoctrination of some kind.
Thank you, Dr. Cullison.
Thank you.
We appreciate you sharing your expertise and perspective with us tonight. We had some great questions online and from some of your former professors here in the room. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you all at home for watching.